title of tonight's event is Using Historic Preservation to Foster Community Development, Lessons and Issues from Historic Boston Inc.'s New Focus on Boston's Neighborhoods. And I think it's really an exciting opportunity for us to think about this really major shift in thinking about what historic preservation, what historic buildings are about. Moving from a vision that privileges architectural history alone, and the son of an architectural historian, so I take architectural history fairly seriously, but moving beyond that to think about the role that historic buildings play, not just in the history of the place, but in the future of a place, in terms of making an area feel like it has texture, feel like it has a past, and make the future thereby more interesting. We are delighted to have Kottaridis, the Executive Director of Historic Boston Inc., here talking to us. Kathy has had a long distinguished career in public service. She's been at the DRA, she's been the Director of the Massachusetts Office of Small Business and Entrepreneurship, and she's been Executive Director of Historic Boston since 2007, and she's also been a great friend of the Rappaport Institute, which we're enormously grateful. Kathy's going to speak first for 20 minutes, and then we're going to have two commenters. Matthew Kiefer, who's the chair of Historic Boston Inc.'s Board of Directors, is going to give us a larger overview on the longer-term path of the organization. And then Alex von Hoffman, who's a senior research fellow at the Joint Center for Housing Studies, and has written many wonderful things. Among them, his book House by House, Block by Block, The Rebirth of America's Urban Neighborhoods. He's going to give us a little bit of a larger context. I would be remiss if I did not mention some forthcoming events next week. The Allison Dining Room at 5:30 on Tuesday. We're going to have Paul Willen, who is a fantastic speaker, talking about whether or not borrower rights improve borrower outcomes, evidence from the foreclosure process. And then on March 27th in the Malkin Penthouse, we're going to be designing play that matters, community planet in the Boston Public Schools. So again, thank you very much for coming. And David Luberoff, our Executive Director, is going to be moderating the event afterwards. And thank you, Kathy.
Kathy.
Oh, great. My next teacher how to use this remote. It's this one, David? Or was that?
We're working at it for years, and we're going to ask you technology questions. Holly? Yes.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure for us to be here this evening, and it's wonderful to have historic preservation be part of conversations about public policy in Greater Boston. We have been, Historic Boston's been in this business for 51 years now, and we have accomplished a great deal, but the conversation has changed considerably as it pertains to historic buildings and placemaking and many of the things that are much more contemporary ways of saying that we care about the places in which we live, and it's wonderful to have that be part of this series. We started this conversation really as a conversation inside with the faculty here about how the work that we do might actually be measured measured in as far as how economic development, or how historic preservation can impact economic development, or how we can measure its role in economic development. Because Historic Boston really is clearly stating these days that the work that it does is intended to achieve greater value in urban neighborhoods. And I can tell you, since I joined HBI in 2007, it's been made very clear to me, but it's also clear to me that people are looking for that connection as well. And we believe that most of our properties and projects and our approaches in real estate development and historic preservation has really aimed to do that over many years, but now we're much more conscious of it and want to be able to explain it. So we began a conversation here really asking the question, how can we do that? And it really led to our saying, let's have a public, begin with a public presentation and conversation, and let's see where it goes. So I think we hope that by the end of this conversation, we'll have a little bit more feedback on that and be able to proceed further. My job really is to tell you about Historic Boston and run through some of the properties we've worked on, our approaches, our strategies, and then have an opportunity to talk more about the present and future. But HBI is a nonprofit organization, and we redevelop historic places to help urban neighborhoods thrive. And the idea really is fairly straightforward. We are not regulators. We are pretty much in the business of figuring out how to reuse older properties so they can meet current needs enrich communities, and restore neighborhood pride, which is a lot to do with a few buildings. The way we work, we're very collaborative. We like to work with communities to build appreciation, but also to understand what's most important to communities. We also want to build partnerships in that regard so that we can leverage other resources to make our projects more feasible. We're entrepreneurial in that we're willing to take risk, but we also work within market forces to guide investments. We're practical and pragmatic. We like to solve problems. So if we see an opportunity, particularly in our origins of saving endangered historic properties, we want to be able to bring what we've learned and really try to unwind the problems that often bind up historic places in difficult circumstances. We also want to be innovative. Now and looking forward, being able to learn from the approaches we take and the experiences of our own, but also of others, and be able to share that knowledge in very practical ways from the experience of actually doing projects. And naturally, we want to transform historic buildings from situations in which they may be undervalued or not well kept into places that people appreciate and understand better and see them in their context. How do we work? Mostly through fairly traditional real estate activities. We acquire and develop historic properties. We carry out feasibility studies. We provide, at times, financing. We also secure financing to carry out projects that we undertake. We utilize tax credits. We might thus far sound to you like a real estate developer, and we often like to call ourselves a nonprofit developer. We raise funds, though, and often, and occasionally rather, make grants to others in order to carry out projects that are otherwise infeasible. We carry through our own staff and the board our development activities and construction management, so we're carrying projects through to completion. And we otherwise provide technical assistance and of a varying sort that may come up and be necessary in helping a property owner or an institution carry forward a preservation project. And we acquire easements and manage those easements on the properties that we've worked on so that we can keep an eye on them. Our origins are in a single building, which we still own at Downtown Crossing, the old corner bookstore, which is at the corner of School and Washington Street. In 1960, it was slated to become a parking garage, which the property adjacent to it, to the right of this bottom image, did proceed to become. But these properties were important because they were and remain today the oldest commercial building in downtown Boston, dating to 1718. It was, though, later in the 19th century, the home to Ticknor and Fields, the publishing house that published many of the American Renaissance authors. Emerson, Thoreau's Walden was published out of this particular spot. Historic Boston was formed at that point by a group of venerable citizens who got together and said this should not happen, and they pooled their resources and made a very critical decision. They decided that this property should go back into use, should be preserved, should be rehabilitated, and should go back into use as a commercial property. And so today, even though for many years, some of you may remember it as a bookstore on the first floor, that was a commercial enterprise, and that helped to support the building. And frankly, that support is critical to HBI's existence. In 1979, HBI recast itself as a citywide historic preservation revolving fund. That's about the time that the Landmarks Commission was formed, and many other tools for historic preservation were put in place, and Boston was fortunate in this case to have a set of private partners who came together and saw the value of having an investment entity that could take on preservation projects within the city. Part of the reason they could do this after 20 years of owning the old corner bookstore was because that building was beginning to throw off resources to support an organization, and this is a very important thing. So the third bullet point really is the most is critical to understanding historic Boston and its model. The old corner bookstore, which might have been considered a questionable investment in 1960, by 1980 was and certainly today is considered to be invaluable to HBI's existence. Its net income really supports HBI's operating activities. It pays for us to have 5 or 6 staff members. It pays for us to carry out other activities, and over time we've borrowed against it to carry out preservation projects in other parts of the city. But owning real estate gives us not just the perspective of being property owners and managers, but it also has given us really, really important resources to keep an organization going and cover our operations. Historic Boston really, though, for the most part, in the early years of its revolving fund activities, was targeting endangered historic properties, not unlike many other preservation organizations all over the country. Some examples of things that we worked on very early on, carried out several projects in Charlestown on Main Street, long before Main Street became the hit place that it has become. But HBI was willing, in this particular case, to partner with a private developer to carry out a larger project that would otherwise preserve the historic building, the Austin block on the first floor. The Dimmitt Community Health Center was another project that was carried out over several years, over more than a decade. And this was where we were working with another nonprofit institutional user, a health center. And HBI's role really was an aggregator of grants and resources and low interest financing tools to put into a building and make preservation of a historic building more tenable to an institution whose priorities and whose mission is something else. Also in Roxbury, the Cedar Street Marble Row Houses was an example where HBI worked with a CDC to help carry out an affordable housing development in a historic building. A set of marble-faced townhouses in the Highland Park area of Roxbury. And HBI provided a line of credit to Urban Edge CDC. We also organized the newly formed condo association that came out of the project as well, which spoke a lot to HBI's talents and strength in property management, and really derived from its many years of managing the Old Corner Bookstore and other properties. The Spooner Lambert House, also in the Highland Park neighborhood of Roxbury, was one in which we've been engaged with for many, many years, and continue to be because we hold a preservation restriction. But that was acquired in 1983, and it wasn't until 1992 at foreclosure that HBI acquired the property and proceeded to take 4 apartments that were involved in that 18th century building, and turn them into higher quality apartments. But it wasn't until 2000 that the decision was made to sell the units and convert them into owner-occupant units. So basically, the people who were living in the apartments were given the first option to purchase the properties, and the last one was sold in 2002. And and I'm sorry, the Steeples Project, how can I avoid this? One of the most challenged types of properties, as I'm sure many of you know, in any community, but really in many urban neighborhoods in particular, are religious properties, purpose-built religious properties. And Historic Boston had a program for many years, and we still maintain some capacity in this, but to work with active religious congregations with historic properties to help them carry forward appropriate planning for their facility, but also to raise funds and provide some grants derived from grants that we received or aggregated from various foundations and re-granted out to the congregations. And we've had considerable success with this. It's very intensive and certainly a higher need than anyone could possibly raise easily. But the Steeples Project was really a national model and continues to be in high demand out there in Boston's neighborhoods, actually throughout the entire city. And I should say, though, that Steeples was one instance in which we were looking at a particular building type and really thinking about how we can organize resources around a type or a thematic type that could be, we where we could learn models and really understand how to deploy them more broadly. We have been, for many years, thinking hard about how we pick our projects, and this is something that changes over time, but one of the things that we have been clear about is that we must be working with the public and our partners to do this. It's funny, as I was preparing this, I was looking at what we currently use for selection criteria for projects and properties that we engage with, and found that they're not too dissimilar to what we have always used as our project selection criteria. There may be slightly different emphases in different places, but for the most part, the first and foremost criterion would be historically or architecturally significant. That's core to our mission and why we exist. However, beyond that, Historic Boston has many other interests in supporting healthy neighborhoods through historic resource preservation, and that's partly to avoid their loss, but also to try and address properties that a mainstream developer would find infeasible to do, and that cannot be undertaken by others all by themselves. But the last one is probably the one that we focus on the most these days, is the places where we will achieve the highest impact and be able to spur additional investment by others. And that's today something we struggle with trying to determine, and that will be something we'd like to have more of a conversation about. In 2006, HPI embarked on a planning process where it was asking the question about preservation in the current context. What were the needs of the city, and what might be the place for Historic Boston to play in the preservation of historic places? Clearly one of the critical issues was increasing impact and understanding how our projects could actually achieve our goal of higher neighborhood revitalization and investment. But we also were interested in this approach developed through our Steeples Project and focused on religious properties, which were thematic groups of building types or areas or specific places where we might focus. But certainly we really wanted to get to the bottom of the place where visual and cultural preservation come together with economic development and measurable impact. And so we looked at a lot of different approaches to that and arrived at neighborhood commercial centers as being places where investment was still lacking, but the opportunities were great. Buildings that were considered important signature places for a community, sort of the living room, the front space for a community, and a place where we felt that we could bring what we've learned over the years and into a concentrated space, and hopefully by virtue of focusing on multiple properties we could achieve stronger neighborhoods and greater investment. So the goals really were to reinforce revitalization activity that many places are undertaking through CDCs and Main Street programs and other things like that, but bring our unique dimension to that. We also wanted to identify many sites that we could prioritize for and with economic development strategies. We wanted to fulfill a need for preservation where we could obviously see it lacking. That was not necessarily the highest priority in other people's efforts to build business development or build other types of activities, whether it's upper story housing and such. We also wanted to test a theory that had been developing in the organization for some time, that by focusing on multiple properties in close proximity, the prospects of a whole place might change through good quality preservation work and associated investments. We wanted to do other things that certainly we are learning along the way, which is more the application of innovative planning initiatives and programming initiatives. But we very much wanted to broaden our own constituency for historic preservation, which I'm sure most people think of as, when I was entering the field, it was little old ladies with white hair and tennis shoes, and now that I have a little bit of that, I have to say, I want to change that. The Neighborhood Centers initiative that we aim to develop focus very much on Main Street districts, because Boston had the advantage of a preservation-based Main Street program framework throughout the city in 19 districts at the time. But we also wanted to work closely and test our partnership skills with CDCs and others. We formed local advisory committees in each one of, we wanted to focus on more than one neighborhood, and we ultimately picked two, and I'll tell you more about that. But we formed advisory committees in each neighborhood. We surveyed and established the priorities for historic buildings, but also just other intangibles, more of an appreciation and educational and research dimension. We work directly with property owners, who are often some of the more difficult individuals to work with in commercial areas, and often stumbling blocks to moving along with improvements. And we wanted to bring our broad toolbox of real estate and preservation solutions to places that we thought qualified. And those, in our case, ended up being places that we felt had a good concentration of historic resources. They might be active commercial centers, but we wanted to know that there was enough work to do. Partners who would work with us and represent important stakeholders, and a sense that if we really focused our efforts over the course of 2 to 5 years, that we would achieve that impact and that focus. Fields Corner in Dorchester, and Cleary and Logan Squares in Hyde Park were the 2 districts we ultimately selected through a competitive process. We put this out to all 19 Main Street districts, received 8 proposals back, which were remarkably good. It was very difficult to choose, but we ultimately knew we couldn't bite off more than we could chew, and we were trying out a new approach and methodology here that, frankly, we were kind of making up as we were going along. And really, this was an effort to start slow and see where we went, but have 2 places that we could compare with one another. Fields Corner really follows the spine of Dorchester Avenue. Very high concentration of new Vietnamese residents, but long-time African Americans, and really a very diverse community that is well positioned physically within the city along the Red Line, so has access to rapid transit. And some of the projects that we've worked on that took some time, and I will tell you what we learned, if nothing else, in the course of trying to walk into a community and promote economic development, promote historic preservation, was that it takes time to build your relationships, and it takes a lot of convincing of property owners and others. But in this particular case, the Goulston building at 1510 Dorchester Avenue, all we could see at the very beginning of walking down the street in a very high impact block was a cornice, which had us wondering and scratching our heads as to whether there might be an opportunity here to unveil something that hid behind it. But we also looked at other things that were important to any commercial property, and that was the cluttering of signage, much of which did not relate necessarily to the business that occupied it, and really felt that there was more to be done here than simply a beautification or a restoration or a rehabilitation project. There were economic issues as well. And in the end, really through a lot of negotiation, but also providing much of the design assistance, project management, and the loan to the owner, we're able to push him to do something that is turning out to be quite a head turner on the street in Fields Corner. And the folks at the bottom right-hand corner are the occupants of the upper floor. It's home to the Dorchester Youth Collaborative, where pretty much is an after-school and weekend program. The best news out of that project, once completed, was that 3 other property owners came forward with requests for assistance, both to us and to the City of Boston, which had some funding in our project at 1510 Ave. And we were beginning to see something that we were hoping we'd see, which is a catalytic effect based on a good model. Things that are up ahead of us, but I think this illustrates the kind of thinking we were able to do with our advisory committee and broader community meetings, was to tell the story of places that have been long forgotten. This is the Dorchester Music Hall, which for most of the 20th century and into the 21st has been a storage building. But it was built as a theater, and you can see some of the shadowing in this solid mass here. But we spent some time really thinking, researching and understanding more about the evolution of the building, and but also pursued some some architectural assistance, and were really able to explain what the building did look like at one point, and how it might be restored for a different use that would benefit from light. But the interesting thing were the oohs and ahs that would come out of the community the minute you show this sort of potential. And I think that that presents the intangible interest of communities and curiosity and pride that comes from improvements like these. And we are looking at opportunities to do residential development here, but there may be other things to consider. Additional research, and again, additional unveilings. The field house, after which the community is named, is attached to that large volume that you saw in the previous image. And we were able to provide some explanation of why that building is there, but also what it used to look like, which is the one on the right, the image on the right, which, you know, it might just be a tidbit of curiosity for someone, but it also begins to put some meaning behind these images, and hopefully give planners and developers and property owners some sense of what they actually have. The other community is Hyde Park, where we are focused in both the Cleary and Logan Squares area in the very center. This building is one that, again, took a couple of years to cultivate. Elderly woman whose father had purchased the building in 1936, and she still lives in the building, and I suspect will continue with us. But she, after a couple of years, decided that the snow was too much and she was ready to transfer, and because we had built a relationship there, she approached us, and ultimately this led to an acquisition. We're in the process of planning an improvement project there that will be mostly focused on envelope and very much focused on the storefronts in the year 2012 into 13, and expect that that will be, yes, transformative, but also will help to stabilize an area that is very much near the Fairmount line, a new initiative that is focused on transit-oriented development opportunities along a new line in the MBTA system. And simple projects, simple things that really just galvanize interest and get people excited about the place and the community they live in, and yet this has an ulterior motive. The Everett Square Theater looked mostly like this center picture through most of the time that we've worked there, and only recently, in the course of working with the owner on trying to figure out how to approach that interior condition, which is set back from the front of the building, we really thought, you know, why not tell people what's here? Nothing else. Let's show what's here, and we developed a signage program which basically restored the historic sign, and it really has pulled people out, and it activated the original lobby, and hopefully that space will be, as it's intended to be, attractive to artists and others to use on a temporary basis, sort of a pop-up opportunity in the front of the building. So while most of our work has been and is now trying to push preservation-based projects along in neighborhoods with buildings that are, in many cases, significant once you explore them, but you might not necessarily pick it up right away when you're traveling through a neighborhood, that there are probably a lot of significant places. We are finding that historic neighborhood centers has bolstered our pipeline, if nothing else, and in many ways changed the organization. We now have a lot of very different relationships and a lot of different types of properties to debate. And really, where the organization in the early years looked at one property at a time and did resolve one issue at a time, now we're looking at a pipeline of 7 projects that are valued at about $12 million that scare us every time we think about what that's going to take to invest in. But the reality is, are really turning out to be, are really translating into a demand that's coming out of the neighborhoods of the city. And it's changing the way we approach the talents that we have in-house on our staff, and also the way in which we think about money, the way we think about fundraising, the way we think about tax credits and other incentives. Certainly we need more of all of those things, but I think this has been very energizing to the organization. So much so that we decided to take another leap, which is to move to Roxbury recently. That was the end game, really, but it really came from a focus focus on the Eustis Street Firehouse, which is the oldest remaining firehouse in the city, but empty since the 1950s. And on our target list since, we think, 1985, in some of our earlier planning. And it wasn't until several years ago, largely with the availability of now state historic tax credits, but also new markets tax credits, that we were, and a focus on Dudley Square, I might add, by the city of Boston and others, that we took a second look at this and really tried to construct a deal and ultimately carry through a $2 million rehabilitation project. And in order to do that, we're going to need tenants in a place like this to be able to pay rent. And one of those tenants is a nonprofit on the first floor, but then Historic Boston decided it should consider moving closer to its own constituencies, the places where we primarily work. We're not doing all that much work in downtown Boston these days. So really, this would be a better launching pad for the kind of work we would do. But it would also be a project that would be emblematic of the kind of work that we want to do in neighborhood commercial districts. And certainly Dudley is an important place to aggregate resources right now. And certainly it's been a substantial change. This building has been very threatened. Those braces really were holding the building up. And we're nearly 20 years old. And yet, we found there was lots and lots of support for a property like this in the community, even though it's very, very small and very hard to reposition. But you see the final effect on the right, and my office is in the very front, in that Palladian set of windows. And I look out every day and I swear I see people who, I'm not joking you, I'm not imagining this in other words. There are people who are constantly talking and stopping and looking at the building and pulling their cars over and taking a look at the transformation of this building, which for so many years was boarded up, vacant, and precariously leaning in the direction of the cemetery, which is the 17th century burying ground next door. Complicated and very difficult and hard to finance, but has been well worth the effort, based minimally on symbolism, but also on the value that really is brought to our organization in many other ways. Now that we've completed this, we are getting requests from various people in various parts of the city to consider properties that we might be interested in that are otherwise endangered or underutilized. And we haven't given up on properties that we've owned for a pretty long time. The Hayden Building, which is H.H. Richardson's only remaining commercial building in Boston, in Chinatown, formerly in Boston's combat zone, or in Boston's former combat zone. I'm not quite sure how you want to say that, but was very much part of the adult entertainment district right up until 1995 or 3 when HBI picked up this property. And it was also in structural disrepair and required a lot of investment that really HBI could really only afford to invest in the first floor here, or activate rather the first floor, and this building that came with the property next door, which is Penang Restaurant, if any of you have been there. But a substantial amount of money went into the envelope of the building, the new windows, new roof, and certainly the masonry that's very distinctive about this particular property. But there it stood, 2nd through 5th floor, empty for nearly 15 years. And it's only now that we're beginning to see part 2, or phase 2 of this project, and that is the activation of the 2nd through 5th floors for market rate rental housing units, which we expect to get started in April and will be done by the early part of 2013. And what this property does, we're predicting, will not only bring our preservation efforts full circle, that we complete something that we started in 1993 and really fully activate a building, because we consider that very important to preservation, but it also allows us to hopefully derive another revenue source that supports our organization on an ongoing basis and allows us to expand our operations. And looking ahead, we're still looking at opportunities in other commercial areas. The Rosendale substation, which is a switching station in Rosy Square, our Rosendale Village, is an underutilized, abandoned building since 1971 that offers offers some opportunities for community uses. And we're thinking about ways to do that and have evaluated different financial ways to approach that, including a farmer's market, a year-round farmer's market, and a function hall that would be unusual in Rossendale Square. And we're also still in the business of saving endangered places, places that are important to context, important to the city and neighborhoods. The Alva Kittredge House in Roxbury's Highland Park neighborhood, where we've had a long relationship, is one that has been deteriorating for many years. And you can see it in its heyday in great glory, but it's a very challenged project at the moment. And we're pleased that the Boston Redevelopment Authority saw the importance of taking this building because of the blighted condition and handing it to HBI to raise necessary funds and proceed with a development project there, which will be 5 units of housing, including some affordable. And then the Malcolm X Al Collins House in Roxbury on Dale Street is another one that we're looking at the moment, mostly to help the current owner, who is the nephew of Malcolm X, address long-time deferred maintenance and care, and hopefully restore it to the period of time in which Malcolm X would have known it, 1941 to 45, but activate it for some sort of educational or residential use. In other words, we're not looking to create a museum here either. This really will be an active living museum that will hopefully house ideally students. I think I am there. Quick snapshot of HBI, Board of 13, Council of Advisors 7, 5 staff, $1.2 million operating budget, cash reserves, and endowed easements. These are math.
Thank you. Matt and Alex, if you would join us. Yes. Let me just say, if you haven't figured this out already, I mean, Kathy has been a member of the Rappaport Institute's advisory board. Just, as Ed said, extraordinary friend of the Institute. And in fact, the genesis of this event came, we had lunch sometime last fall, and Kathy was just explaining to me what the organization was up to and what it was trying to figure out. And I said, we should do an event. So I'm glad you agreed with me. And I think the other thing is that this works because Kathy brings an extraordinary level of knowledge of people and places and history. And the reward for that is I keep sending students and other people to Kathy when somebody asks me a question. I don't know the answer.
Well, since we're doing advertisements, I couldn't do this without having come here to the Kennedy School on a Rappaport fellowship.
So, as Ed mentioned, we have Matt Kiefer, one of Boston's leading real estate attorneys, particularly in this field, who's been chair of the HBI board, who's been involved with it for years, and also Hoffman, our good friend. Matt, I'm going to ask a question, but you can ruin it on whatever you want. But when we talked the other day, you mentioned that the shift to neighborhoods and this idea on neighborhood revitalization predate. I mean, in part, you hired Kathy to execute a strategy that was already underway, and I'm wondering now that you're several years into this, what's been the biggest surprises as you've actually tried to carry out this new plan? Either positive or negative.
Right. I might just inflect my answer a little bit to talk about challenges. I don't know if they were all surprises, but the things that we found challenging, as you could see from Kathy's presentation, you know, it's a great organization in many ways. I realize I'm not objective, but we have a very focused mission. We have a really engaged board. We have a terrific staff. And we had gone through this strategic planning exercise. A longtime executive director had retired after 25 years, which, among other things, sort of crystallized a focus we'd already evolved into, but really crystallized it into a focus on using historic resources as engines of neighborhood revitalization. And that informed our search. And we were lucky to find Kathy, who has one of the delightful surprises is that I think we are farther along to where we wanted to be than we might have even guessed in the period of time that Kathy's been with us. We didn't plan this really, and I didn't even see her presentation until we just saw this. So, I mean, that's been a delightful surprise, but the things that, there are 2 or 3 things that, you know, we're very project focused. There are 2 or 3 things that we find to be very challenging continually, and really would be useful maybe to get people's perspective on. It's a little hard to tell our story because it's a little bit of a complicated story. Our mission's focused, but people think of preservation as, we often refer to it as sort of the curatorial approach to historic artifacts. That's not who we are. It's not really about the past, it's about the future, really, in our view, and it's not really about the buildings. It's the buildings, it's the effect the buildings can have on people's lives. And that's a little bit of, we struggle a little bit about how to tell that story and how to broaden our constituency without losing our kind of preservation constituency and core. The second thing we agonize about a lot is how do we select projects? We don't have the resources to do all the projects we want to do. And Kathy mentioned the programmatic focus that we've developed. We kind of have a little bit of a, how much should we be geographically focused? How much should we be thematically focused? How do we choose people? We are in the very envious position that people come to us with projects because we've done some good ones recently. And so, and they're all projects that the private market wouldn't do on its own. And we can't do them all. So we agonize a little bit about that, about how to select them. And then the last thing, what sort of follows from that is risk. We agonize about risk. When you're a developer, you're kind of used to that when you're a for-profit developer because there's a risk-reward ratio and that's where you live. And if you're a good developer, you figure out how much risk you can take. You figure out how to minimize your risk and how to make sure that you have the staying power to go on to the next project. When you're mission-oriented, it's a difficult calculus. I mean, we're there to take risks. That's what we're doing. We're taking risks that developers won't take. We're doing projects that developers won't do. But if we take too much risk, we're out of business. You know, we're very entrepreneurial. We don't have, we're lucky that we have this asset that pays our operating, our overhead, but we go out and raise money for each project and we expect it to generate revenue that either carries itself or maybe when we're done we sell it and take that and go on and do the next one. If we screw up 2 or 3 times in a row, we're out of business. So how do you, there's no formula, but how do you think about that? And sometimes the seemingly worthiest projects are the riskiest ones. So that's another sort of, I don't know if I call it a surprise, but an ongoing challenge.
Alex, Kathy and I, as many of you know, we try to have our panels often be a mixture of people bringing academic and practitioner perspective.
People who are practical and know how to do things, and people who don't.
And then people who your words, not mine. But as we were sort of going through different folks, and then it was like, well, of course it's Alex, because Alex, of course, is a noted urban historian, but also in the block by block book, somebody who's looked at city revitalization. So I'm wondering, as you've listened to this story, as we talked the other day, how unique, what's striking about this blending of historic preservation very much as a community revitalization strategy? What else would you highlight out of here as things that we should pay careful attention to?
Well, it's unique, and I must say, exciting. It's exciting. It's community development, as most of the people in the room know, has many forms. You have Convent Square, they have a health clinic. There are all different ways of going about it. but I don't think any other group that I've ever encountered has made history, in the sense of historic preservation, as the mode of community revitalization. There are a lot of wonderful CDCs around the country that have done historic preservation, and I was glad to hear Kathy and Matt describe what they do, because it's a little bit different. They're going at it the other way. So as a historian, you're right, David, I'm delighted. I'd say, well, I came up with a couple of ways of thinking about this, and I don't know if they're the only ways, but they're sort of issues that come up. And the one, as we talked about the other day, Kathy and I many years ago crossed paths at the Bostonian Society, and at that time I was in charge as a board member of coordinating with the local historical societies. And that grew out of my enthusiasm for Jamaica Plain and trying to understand what Jamaica Plain was all about and its history. So one of the things everybody who lives here knows it's special about Boston and its communities is that sense of place. And the sense of place is bound up in the history of the place. What it looks like, what it was before. We don't necessarily know all that. So I think what's wonderful about this is the way Historic Boston is tackling that directly. This kind of historic preservation can promote a sense of community identity and loyalty to that community through a sense of shared history. And I think what's wonderful, what I've seen around this town, is the way that the newest arrival to a neighborhood inherits everything that happened before in that neighborhood. They may not care to enjoy it or may care to enjoy it, but it's all that person's legacy. And I've seen this around town. I thought I saw Byron Rushing in the, yes. So Byron Rushing is the leader of this idea. He has been so...
Those of you who don't know, state representative from the South End and former, longtime sort of historic preservationist.
Well, an historian. He's so enthusiastic about it. When I first met him, we were on some committee, and the South End's history, Roxbury's history, Jamaica Plain's history, he loves all of that, and in that wonderful way, he just loves it for itself, and then he tells other people about it, and they get excited. There was a wonderful group here for a number of years called My Town, which trained young people in these neighborhoods to be tour guides, historic tour guides of their neighborhoods, doing several things at once, teaching the young people how to be tour guides, but also, in order to do that, they had to master their history. And I talked with a few of these young folks, and what I loved about it is they wanted to know not about what had happened in the last 10 years or 20 years. They wanted to know about the colonial past, and which just brought that home, that we all inherit that, whether we just arrived as immigrants or new arrivals from out of town, or we go back several generations here. And I think that's what Historic Boston can tap into. I also really appreciate the way it's practically in every slide you had, the theme of collaboration, of partnering, of working with the local groups. Because honestly, this kind of thing, if you fly in and you say, we love your old building and we're going to fix it up, you may not really have gotten accomplished much, and you may actually engender resistance and hostility. In the way you're going about it, as far as I can understand, this kind of historic preservation is the opposite of urban renewal. The more I thought about it, it seemed like it's just opposite. Urban renewal that ignored residents and literally destroyed the fabric. You're going in and you're working with residents to work with their program. So I noticed that maybe as an urban guy, I might say, well, let's take the big old house that has the little storefronts, let's take the storefronts, restore it. But I like the way you're sensitive to the way people use them now and the way they want to use these properties. I think this is a unique part of this. You'll see a lot of private historic preservation, and bless those people that are wealthy enough to buy a house in the South End and restore it lovingly. But they have their own agenda, you know, because they're private people. That's fine. This is a little more communal, so that's the second point I'd stress. The third is the hardest question of all, is where are we going? Not only once you make your strategic decision, I can see there's long nights with lots of coffee trying to figure that out. Where will it lead? Because community development has a kind of ambiguous meaning. It means neighborhood revitalization, but what do we mean by that? Well, one thing I can tell is historic Boston resembles in its approach that of community development corporations, the better ones, which go into economically depressed areas that have very little investment, maybe are losing population, they're so unpopular, and I've been looking for a metaphor for many years, if anyone has it. It's the opposite of the canary in the coal mine. They actually show, but they're the first people in because the private investors can't see it, and even a lot of the residents often can't see it, to show that there's value there. There's something valuable. Not even necessarily monetarily, but there's something valuable. And that can start, along with other things, a chain of reactions, which I think you mentioned, in which people start, I think I'll paint the house, or I'll fix up the house, and or we'll maybe, as you saw, the businesses, they can say, well, all right, maybe we'll put the money in, you know, there's something worth it. But, and now here comes, and this will be my last point about this, the ticklish part. Well, you've got something going, but where is it going? Neighborhood revitalization can take many forms. It could be this modest fixing up of places, a little more investment, maybe attracting a few more people, because let's be honest, some of the neighborhoods that we are looking at don't have enough people in them, but they'd be more or less the same kind of people who are there. Immigrants or African Americans, if that's the kind, whatever the mix, or some mix that's similar to that, lower middle class, working class, somewhere in there. But it would be a bustling place. I kind of like to emphasize that image because we don't see that so much anymore. Our neighborhoods tend to go down or they go up, but they don't stay. It is entirely possible to have a bustling but not very wealthy neighborhood. And there are parts of New York City that I could give you as an example. So that's one thing. But we also might get other investors. And the next thing you know, we've got higher income folks investing, and the whole business is going up. And dare I say it, the dread word, gentrification occurs. And then it becomes something different. Well, I don't think anybody at this table or in the room can control this thing, but that's the kind of spectrum. And it's something, I don't think you need to bother trying to control it, as long as you're aware of it, and that may allow you to jump to the next log without going into the drink. But I think those 3 points, that the shared history, the coordination with the local folks, and the kind of neighborhood revitalization that you're trying to do are what make historic Boston unique in my mind.
Yeah, I don't know, respond to anything Alex said before we open up for questions. For those of you trying to figure out the rest of your evening, we will end, as we always do, no later than 7 o'clock. And we'll open up to questions in a minute, but I did want to, there's been a bunch of things thrown on the table, so I don't know. You can pass, or no.
Well, I think the only thing I would echo is the effort to engage a broad cross-section of people, or very specific communities, has really turned out to be a really important means by which we have been able to educate communities as well, not just about the history, but about the economics of their community. I mean, we can actually have, sit down and explain why it's important to plan for certain types of business changes, or whether it's important to get, if it's an empty space, attract a certain type of use because of what they can pay or cannot pay, or anything like that. It's been a really interesting process by which we're finding ourselves often talking the non-historical language and much more the real estate and economic development story to communities. So it's not just about building the pride of a place, but it's a real understanding of, that's my way of reading to Matt to describe preservation and gentrification. Because he does it really well.
Well, yeah, it is a hot potato. I'm going to say something a little provocative here. That's not one of the things I agonize about, at least. I won't speak for my entire board, but I was trying to sort of give you our board perspective. We actually have another board member in the audience who may feel differently. Gentrification is often a bad word for a good thing. It is a pejorative term for economic development in low-income neighborhoods, which actually advantages the residents of those neighborhoods. And there is a point, it's funny, Alex, you used the term chain reaction. There is a point at which it's a runaway reaction. It happened in Charlestown, the first neighborhood that the HBI was active in. We began in a neighborhood that was really undergoing a transition, an economic and social transition in the 1970s, and did a couple of projects there, and it sort of took off, and it didn't really need us anymore. We made our little contribution to that, I guess, but we sort of moved on. And I guess you could say that neighborhood became gentrified. Is that a bad thing? I mean, I live in Jamaica Plain. I've lived in the same house for 25 years in Jamaica Plain. My neighborhood, as does Kathy, but how long have you lived in JP? You've had the same 22 years, so you've seen the same trajectory. Right in the heart of Jamaica Plain, neither in the most problematic part of the neighborhood 25 years ago, nor in the nicest part, kind of right in dead center Jamaica Plain. My neighborhood has gentrified in 25 years. I'm glad of it, and I think almost all of my neighbors are glad of it. And many of my neighbors have been there for that entire 25-year period of time. There are no vacant storefronts on Center Street. There are no abandoned houses. There were cars torched around the corner on a very dark street around the corner from my house. Whenever my parents would visit, or my in-laws, there would be a torched car around the corner. There are no torched cars anymore. Dog walkers, walk their dogs after dark and feel safe. I see something I never saw 25 years ago, women walking home, getting off the T, the Orange Line, after dark, sometimes 6, 7, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night, women by themselves walking home from the T. That's a good thing. So if that's gentrification, sign me up. There is a piece of that that is not good, and that is low-income renters being displaced involuntarily. It's a small problem. It's not one we ever knowingly contribute to, but it's a small problem, and to paint it with this broad, and something ought to be done about that. And in fact, we live in a city with an inclusionary housing program that tries to address that. Most neighborhoods have a fairly high proportion of protected affordable housing, deed-restricted affordable housing, to try to address it. Is it perfect? No. But it's a problem that is acknowledged and that people try to address. So, I'm probably sounding a little defensive here. I think what we do, if we trigger, if you want to call it gentrification, what we're doing in Roxbury, okay, I'm okay with that. So far, I haven't felt as though we've done something that has crossed that line into involuntarily displacing people from their neighborhood.
Let me open it up to, I've got thousands of questions, but you've been very patient. Remind you that the to Kennedy School ground rules. Please identify yourself, and a question is a short statement that is a request for information, or a response. A response is not, in fact, a speech. We've got lots of kids, so why don't we just start here and then move 1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, my name is Jelani Karamoko. I'm a second-year student at Harvard Law School. I was wondering if you could talk about your collaboration with city and state development agencies. Where do those negotiations tend to center around? And in general,